Kia ora koutou, ko Douglas Walker, toko ingoa. I'm here today with Kerry, and Kerry is going to lead us through Level 2 AgHort Physical Factors. If you've got any questions during the presentation, if you could pop them in the chat, I'll either interrupt Kerry in a presentation, or I'll hold those questions to the end if it's more appropriate. If you've got any problems, questions relating to the standards, then we're more than happy to field those just now, and I'm sure that you'll be able to get the answers that you need to support you towards your external. So without further ado, over to you, Kerry. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you for having me. So today we'll be looking at the first of the three standards. So today is looking at physical factors. These are looking at the techniques that are used to modify those physical factors and how it impacts the environment in terms of New Zealand's plant production. So this standard covers both agriculture and horticultural techniques. So it's quite a big standard, and depending on what you have covered at your school, some of it you may have just been directed in some particular line. So some of it might be new, some of it might not be. So hopefully most of it's not, and we will just truck our way through. So the plan today is to look at each of those physical factors, then look at how they modify the environment, so what impact they have on plant production, and then moving into using those techniques, what techniques can we use to modify each of those physical factors. And along with that, we have to understand the plant processes that we are affecting. Okay, so we'll just move to the next page. So here is the standard. So for achieve, you need to demonstrate understanding, and here you need to describe those techniques that you are looking at. So firstly, depending on the physical factor, you need to either choose the technique that you're going to look at, or you may be given it in the exam. So here you would discuss what the techniques are that you will be covering and describe how that's carried out. So this is normally in the exam there is 3 questions, and that will be looking at a minimum of 3 physical factors. To achieve, you need to do a minimum or pass minimum of 2 physical factors, and you need a minimum of 2 techniques. So you need to make sure that you understand how it is carried out and tell the examiner how it is done. You then need to state what it does to the physical factor. So does it increase light? Does it decrease the light, etc.? So you need to explain what it's doing to that physical factor. Moving into merit, and a little box should come up the side here. This is where you're demonstrating in-depth understanding. So you're explaining why those techniques are carried out. So you need to link those to plant processes, and we'll cover those. Those are things such as photosynthesis, respiration, transpiration, germination, ripening, etc. So you need to link to those, link to plant growth, so how the plant is growing, but also looking at growth rate. So is it increasing, is it decreasing? So here you would be starting to say, we carry out this technique because of this, or as a result of this, photosynthesis will increase. Or decrease. Okay, so you're trying to use those linking words so that you're linking what you talked about for the achieved part, moving it into why it is carried out. You then need to link those to plant production, and this is looking at crop yield, quality, and timing. Because the standard is looking at commercial production, it is you understanding that you are growing a crop to sell to a market. So therefore, if a market is requiring 100 plants on the 1st of December, then you need to supply 100 plants on the 1st of December. So you need to be looking at that crop yield, you need to be looking at the quality of that crop, and you need to look at the timing. So a merit and higher needs to cover those 3 things. And we'll go into more depth later. The excellence part, this is where you're evaluating those techniques and what is going to be the best technique to use. Now, these come in 3 main areas, so that's economic, environmental, and social. So you need to relate those things back to the technique. So here, and I've once again brought up the excellence words on the side, you're going to be either comparing or contrasting or justifying the use of one of those techniques that you've looked at in terms of the economic, environmental, and social. Okay, so we will go through and discuss each one of those. But once again, it is looking at it in a commercial context. So what are the economic benefits or negative impacts? What are the environmental impacts? And what are the social impacts of carrying out this production? Okay, so we'll move now into the first part, which is looking at physical factors. Okay, so there's a huge range of physical factors, and in the exam, as I said, there'll be a minimum of 3 covered. So physical factors are any environmental factor that is not caused by a living organism. So these are traditionally, if you do bio, discussed as abiotic factors. And so we cover frost, wind, light, temperature, water, humidity, hail, snow, air, which includes carbon dioxide, oxygen, and nitrogen, topography, and then soil, which also covers the inclusion of nutrients. So this is your soil type, etc. So it's a big standard. That's lots of physical factors covered. Remember, you will only be examined on a minimum of 3. Okay, so some of these won't be assessed at all in the exam. Okay, so we're going to look at the first one, and this is light. Okay, so what is light all about? So the things I've got there on the screen are talking about the impacts of light. So we have sunshine hours. So as you all know, all throughout New Zealand, we have different number of sunshine hours. So this is the solar radiation duration. So it's the length of time that solar radiation hits in those particular areas. Now, some areas are quite high and are known for their sunshine hours, such as Nelson, which has one of the highest sunshine hours, and then down to areas which don't get so much sunshine as the other parts of the country. So ones with big numbers are such as Blenheim and Nelson, so they get 2,405 sunshine hours a year in comparison to, say, Invercargill, which only has 1,600 sunshine hours. Some plants require sunshine hours to ensure that they get enough of those solar radiation to ensure ripening. So some crops can be planted in Nelson, but they cannot be planted in Invercargill for light reasons. So these are dependent, solar radiation is dependent on 4 things, and that's what I've got under there. Why are the differences? So the first one is the latitude. So Auckland will receive twice as much sunlight as Invercargill in winter, for example. It is the slope of the land. So north-facing slopes receive far more light than south-facing slopes. So therefore, you're better to plant your crops on north-facing slopes. That is opposite in the Northern Hemisphere. The amount of cloud cover. So if you get a lot of cloud cover, you reduce that light level. And lastly, the wind. So westerly locations have lower sunshine hours than easterly, and that is mainly due to those cloud cover and those wind, that wind capacity. Okay, so if we move into light intensity, we measure this in lux, and this is impacted by the time of the day. So some parts of the day have more light intensity than other parts, so that's why the midday till 2 o'clock or 2 to 3 in the summer, it is more likely you will get sunburned. So the light intensity is a lot higher because of the way the sun falls as it comes around the planet. So it has a bigger spread on the morning and in the evening, and then as it comes higher, that intensity spreads. So it's to do with the rays and the angle that it hits the planet. Okay, so the second part there is the seasons of the year. So we get more light in different parts of the season, and that is to do with the Earth's tilt and axis away from the planet and from the sun as it rotates around. So that changes those seasons. The next is latitude, so where we are in the planet. So if you're closer to the equator, you will get more light intensity than if you are further away. And then lastly, looking at topography. So north-facing slopes get more light than south-facing slopes. Okay, so that's just starting to get you to think about some of those impacts on light. So the next thing is that intensity in photosynthesis. So just trying to relate it here to a plant process, and we'll do that more in a moment. But that light intensity, the more light you get, in general, the better it is for photosynthesis. It does then peak and drop off, but basically the more light that it receives, the increased rate of photosynthesis. So we then move into different wavelengths. So this is a lot about physics here. So wavelengths and the colour. So each of those have different wavelengths and a different colour. And some plants take in those different colours and use it for photosynthesis better. So plants tend to, if we look at the Roy G. Biv, plants tend to use infrared, red, light and blue, indigo and violet better than they use something like orange, yellow and green. Okay, so if you use those types of light, they will increase their intensity and therefore increase the photosynthesis. Hence why some glasshouses use different colour screening, such as pink on their orchards or in their glasshouses. Okay, the next one is lastly on light, is looking at the plant responses to light. So the first one there is phototropism. This is the way the light comes to the plant and the angle it is on. Plants will grow towards the light. So assuming you're wanting your plant to grow well, it needs to be a balanced light. If it's continuously getting it from one angle, the plant will grow that way. So if you have pot plants growing inside, often they will grow towards the light. Okay, and then we look at photoperiodism, and this is the day length. Some plants are short day plants, some are long day plants, and some are day neutral plants, and that will determine their flowering regime. So some plants, such as chrysanthemums and poinsettias, they're short day plants, and therefore they will only flower when the day length is shorter than 12 hours, and therefore they have a longer night length. Okay, so therefore that means they flower in autumn. So if you're trying to grow them out of season, such as for Mother's Day, you will have to manipulate those light levels in which to do that. So chrysanthemums are quite often given in Mother's Day, which is usually in March, and therefore that is good for them because that is going from summer into autumn. So, but if you're wanting them to grow outside that time, then you will have to manipulate that light. Okay, so that's enough on about what light actually is. We're going to move straight into the effect of light on growth of the plant. So light controls photosynthesis, and it also has an impact on evapotranspiration. So we'll talk about that in a moment, but it also heats the surrounding area. So that's the secondary impact of light. It then, as we've talked about, the higher the intensity, the higher the photosynthesis that will take place. The more light that hits the canopy or the leaves, the higher the photosynthesis, therefore more sugar will be made, and therefore you'll have a higher fruit yield. So this is relating to the merit part of it, and we'll come back in a moment. And then moving into looking at the light, the direction where the light is coming from will, as I say, determine the way the plant grows. And lastly, day length will determine that flowering and when the crop matures. Okay, we'll move on to temperature. Once again, this is a big one because it has a big impact on plants. So New Zealand's temperature varies, as you're aware, right across the country. So you do need to be mindful of where we are in the country to what those temperatures are. So we usually look at the minimum, maximum, mean, critical, and optimum temperatures, and plants have all of these. So the minimum is the lowest temperature that they can survive at. Maximum is the highest temperature that they usually can survive at. Mean is what they prefer, or their average temperature. And then we move into critical. Critical is at those extremes. That is the very last temperature, or the lowest temperature they can survive at, or the hottest. And then optimum is what they prefer mostly. So most plants in New Zealand have optimum range, and that's what we like to grow them in. Next, moving into growing degree days. So this is the accumulated heat for an area above a base temperature. And this is used to determine where plants grow in the country. So all parts of the country are slightly different. For example, if we look at Auckland, they are 1600, and if we go to Dunedin, it is 600. Now, if you're determining where you grow plants, for example, eggplants require 1,000 growing degree days. So therefore, you can't grow, well, it probably wouldn't be best to grow eggplants in Dunedin because they're not going to have enough of that heat temperature in which to mature the crop. However, some other plants will grow them much better, such as peas, because they only require 600 growing degree days, or they start at 600 and they move up to 800. So growing peas there is going to be perfectly fine. Next one is looking at soil temperature. So this is predominantly determined that optimum growth rate. So soil temperature is dependent also for germination. So for example, maize likes a soil temperature of 13 degrees. It will not germinate below that. So if you plant your crops and the soil temperatures are only 11, it will sit there until that soil temperature is of an optimum temperature. So that's usually above 13. So we can manipulate soil temperature to increase root growth, and we'll talk about that later. So the next one is dormancy. So this is particularly when we're looking at buds on fruit trees. They have a dormant period, but also seeds. So this is where they just go into hibernation, but often that needs to be broken in terms of some chilling or some way temperature may impact on it. Next one is veneralisation. This will only be looked at if you're looking at fruit trees. This is the effect of temperature on that flower initiation. So it needs to have a particular temperature for that flowering to occur, and also for bud break. And then we have some plants that require chill requirements. So these are plants that need a certain number below a specific temperature. And this is why cherries are grown in Otago predominantly. They require, same with apricots actually, they require a chill requirement, and they need to be at that temperature to break that dormancy and get a good fruit set. Okay, so effect on temperature. This is whether it's above the optimum or below the optimum. I haven't done optimum because you should get all the things happening that you want it to happen. But if it's above the plant's optimum, it will increase that rate of photosynthesis, transpiration, respiration, and evaporation. However, it may, if those are too high, if that temperature is too high, it may cause death. Or it may reduction in the plant's yield because it's over capacitating for that high temperature. It can cause damage to the flowers by scalding, and also sunburn or windburn from those high temperatures. And then we sort of have the opposite direction, opposite impacts for below the plant's optimum. So this reduces the rate of photosynthesis and respiration, can cause death, can reduce the plant's yield, once again have damage to those flowers, may cause some plants to go into dormancy, and you'll have a reduction in germination because they just won't germinate because the soil is too cold. Did that change? Oh, yeah. Okay, next one is looking at soil temperature. So this is just re-emphasising what I just said. So this is looking at increasing or decreasing those germination rates, like I said, for maize. It's looking at that uptake of water and nutrients. If that's at an optimum, that will occur faster. That's looking at those chemical reactions in the soil between the soil and the roots. Activity of bacteria and microorganisms in the soil increases if they're at warmer temperature. If it's too cold, that won't happen. And then also taking up of nutrients such as nitrogen. So it will affect that if it's too cold or too hot. Okay, so frosts is the next one. There are two types of frosts, air frosts and ground frosts. Remember, frosts are when water and moisture has gone down to the ground usually, or if it's particularly cold, it'll be an air frost. But this is when the temperature has lowered. So you require moisture for a frost, but you also require those very cold temperatures. Okay, so we measure those frosts either by the air or by the ground, dependent on the type, and it freezes everything that's in that vicinity of that frost. So frosts usually occur on the ground and then move up, because remember, cold air settles and hot air rises. So we do have some positive effects of frost, and that is such as it gets rid of pests and diseases, and so therefore there'll be less of those. But negative effects is that it affects the plants, and this is where you want to go. So if a frost has occurred, often it will burst the cells in that plant, and so therefore they're injured, and it will die, flacken off and die. Flower buds won't open, flowers may be killed. So this is dependent on the time of the year, okay, of when that frost is. If it's got a crop on, it may cause frost burn, therefore you can't sell it. Leaves will fall off, but basically significantly reduces the crop yield. Okay, we're going to move on now to water. And so once again, this is a big one, and predominantly used in most of plant processes. So we have to look at the type of what we get, where we get water from, and predominantly we get that from rainfall. So New Zealand gets a lot of rain, so that's a good thing for us. But some of that rain is not effective. So some of it will run off, some of it will get used, just pass through the soil and won't get into that root zone and can't be used. So we need to be mindful of that when we're looking at water. Some water is not effective because it's too hard or the intensity is too high. Not all rainfall is good. A lot of it will be taken up with evaporation, so that will be determined how hot the area or the climate is in that particular area, and also your topography. So if you're on steep slopes, obviously the water will drain off or run off a lot faster than if it's on a flat area. Okay, so the role of water in plants is it's used for transpiration, photosynthesis, evaporation, and it opens and closes through the stomata. And we'll look at those in a little bit more depth in a moment. Okay, then the last little section I've got there is you need to understand the infiltration rate. So that's how it goes through the soil. It will depend on the soil permeability. So that's looking at your soil texture. So clay obviously holds water more. Sand, it goes through the soil a lot more quickly. Okay, so you will lose that water. So, and how it flows through will be dependent on those three things at the bottom. So you will find that it's at saturation point where there's too much water. You want it to be at field capacity because that's when the plant has the optimum amount of water. And then lastly is wilting point where there's not enough water in that soil. So you're trying to optimize that, and you're trying to get your plants to be at field capacity permanently. So water is not a limiting factor. Okay, effect on water on plant growth. As I said, it is the key component in photosynthesis and respiration. So too little water, photosynthesis is reduced. Too much water, particularly in the root zone, means that your plants cannot respire. So remember, plants take in oxygen, and that is in the same space that water takes in the soil. So you need to have the soil-water ratio balanced to ensure that you get some water but also some oxygen. Water is also responsible for the structure of the plant, so that's the turgid pressure. Otherwise they will wilt and there'll be no structural support. When the plant is wilted, there is no growth taking place. Also used in germination, so to soften that seed coat, allow for that enzyme activity to start to continue, and then they start respiring and they're going to grow. And lastly, it's used for that transport of those minerals from the soil up through the plant, the carbohydrates that's been made from photosynthesis, from the leaves all the way through the plant. Okay, next one is humidity. This is the amount of moisture in the air, and we need to have an understanding of how we measure that. So normally you can measure that very easily using a hydrometer. It just tells you with a wet and dry bulb how much humidity is in the air. The Waikato and Auckland areas tend to be quite humid. We're pretty humid today, actually. So not very sunny. We've got a lot of overcast cloud, but we are very muggy, so that humidity is quite high. So the good thing about humidity is that it retains that moisture. It reduces the amount of water loss from the plant, and it usually increases the growth of the plant. So high humidity improves the growth and has higher yields. Okay, so that's humidity. Right, moving on to hail and snow. So hail is solid ice that is formed usually as it comes from a thunderstorm or some very extremely cold areas of cloud, and then is dropped as hard, lumpy, solid stones. These obviously decimate the crop if it hits. The next one is snow, and this is just ice crystals that usually flow down when we get lower temperatures, so that's closer to the earth itself. But both of these play big impact on the effect on the crop. So firstly is if you get a hailstorm like Nelson did on Boxing Day of last year, it completely decimates your crop. So it strips them of leaves. Here is showing you a hop crop from last year. The stone just goes straight through the leaves. It breaks it off, it strips it. So therefore, you will have no more leaves left for light absorption. So they cannot carry out photosynthesis, and therefore there'll be minimal plant growth from now on. If you have a crop on like they did this year, such as apples, then they are smashed. So they will split, they mark, they bruise, they reduce their quality, and they cannot be sold usually because bacteria and mold grows in them. If you're in the flowering stage, it will reduce the flowers. So therefore, if you've happened there, you have got less yields and you're going to have lower employment opportunities. They didn't harvest predominantly most of the Motueka area due to that. Okay, then looking on snow, once again, we don't tend to get a huge amount of this in New Zealand, but it is decimating depending on the time of the year that it occurs. If it sits there for long periods of time, it freezes the plant, and therefore the plant will do the same as what it has with frost. It will blacken off and die. If it sits on there too long, it compresses the plant and kills it. If it sits on there for days and days, then obviously growth is not going to occur. So usually this is physical damage of breaking of branches, crushing of those herbaceous plants or those soft plants. And once again, no light absorption is going to occur. Plant cells will die. Mature fruit gets frost burn on it. And once again, reduces that yield, reduces those flowers, reduces those fruit, and therefore, once again, you're not going to be picking. So a huge impact. Okay, we're getting through these. So the next one is looking at air. So this is broken into three areas, so carbon dioxide, oxygen, and nitrogen. So carbon dioxide, oxygen is obviously used in photosynthesis. Oxygen is required for respiration, and nitrogen is used by some plants to increase their growth. So I'll just quickly go straight on to carbon dioxide. So usually the carbon dioxide that plants require is enough in an outdoor environment. However, it's often not enough in an indoor environment. So carbon dioxide is only present in about 0.03% of the air. So we can manipulate that to increase our photosynthesis rate. Okay, so this will ensure higher yields, earlier flowering, better fruit setting, and warmer soils, etc. So we get higher growth if we can manipulate. So obviously difficult to manipulate outside, but quite easily to manipulate in a glass house. And then oxygen and nitrogen. So once again, oxygen is required for respiration. We need plants to uptake it. The easiest way to ensure that is to ensure you have your soil at field capacity. Okay, if it has too much of water in it, then that's going to become a limiting factor and respiration won't occur. So if you have a good respiration rate, then you're going to improve that plant growth once again and vigor. And then next one is nitrogen. So this is a macronutrient. This is required in a lot, is required for plants for growth, so making proteins, nucleic acid, and used in the process of photosynthesis in the chlorophyll. Plants can normally get that from the soil. Some plants, such as your clover, are able to nitrogen fix by the microorganisms in their roots, and therefore they can get it out of the air. So just a reminder that can occur. Right, so wind. Wind, as you know, is used by pressure. So once again, physics. Used by warm air rises and cold air lowers. So this causes wind to move from one place to another. Our predominant wind in New Zealand is a westerly, so it comes from the west, and these are usually pretty strong. So we can here look at different anticyclones and cyclones, etc. But today we'll just move straight on to look at what effect that wind has. So depending on how strong that wind is depend on the crop. And as you can see in this particular picture, it's flattened it. So flattening is usually called lodging, and that occurs predominantly in cereal crops. This is where the plant has been completely pushed over and broken. It will not regrow. So that's a permanent displacement to its stem. It will not stand up. Now, some crops, you can still harvest it like that. Other crops, no, you cannot. So that will have 100% yield loss. But wind too much will defoliate, so lose the leaves. It will increase transpiration, so by removing that water faster, so this reduces the plant growth. The fruit can rub together, so reducing that quality. The rocking of the plant in the wind can cause root damage. It may cause the plants to grow unevenly. If you've been to the beach, the westerlies, you can see the impact it has on the plant growth. Bees and insects don't fly in wind, heavier wind, so you'll have reduction in pollen. If the fruit is knocked off the tree, you'll have fruit loss. It takes longer to ripen because the temperature is cooler with wind. It does reduce humidity, which is great because that reduces your chance of disease. And lastly, it removes the chance of of frost. So there's you will not get a frost if you have wind. Okay, so topography is the slope of the land and how it lies. So New Zealand, we range from being very steep, so the high country in the South Island, to flat areas. So depending on where you are, depend on that topography. So we'll just go straight into effect of topography on plant growth. So this is a slight sloping land to the north. Facing the north will have higher light, so therefore it increases plant growth. It usually is warmer, it usually has good drainage, and it decreases the chance of frost. So this is an optimum level, optimum place for growing crops. However, depending on how steep your land is, soil will erode from it. So you will have less good soil at the top of a hill, per se, than at the bottom. The bottom contains a lot more fertile soil. The east coast is drier than the west coast, and that is to do with our winds. So as the winds pick up over the ocean, it picks up water, it dumps it on the west coast because it hits those mountains and therefore comes over, and the east coast is drier. So you need to irrigate on that side. And then if you have microclimates, this is where you get small patches of areas that might be warmer than other places. They're normally within that mesoclimate. So the mesoclimate is your whole region, or the regional sort of climate that you get, and then a microclimate is within that. And some are definitely warmer in different parts than others. Okay, soil. This is a huge one just by itself, looking at the different soil type. We've talked about temperature, talked about water, but also the nutrient status, so how much nutrients they can hold on to and keep, what their pH is, and whether they have a mineral deficiency. So a lot of information can be stored here, particularly on that soil type and its characteristics. So how does it impact on plant growth? Well, depending on your soil type will depend on what nutrients that holds, and they need to have the big three, so nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So nitrogen is predominantly used in growth, and it's required for photosynthesis, so plant growth. Phosphorus is usually used in flowers and fruit, So if you're a flowering and fruiting plant, you need to have a lot more of that than other plants will need. And then potassium is also used in those as well as respiration. So it's good for root growth. Once again, talked about soil eroding and then looking at that availability of nutrients and the pH. So you need to make sure your pH is where your plants can uplift those nutrients. And then once again, looking at the tops of those soils. All right. So that is all our plant physical factors that we need to look at. So now we need to look at how this impacts on plant growth. So we're trying plant productivity and plant production. So these are the three that we're predominantly looking at. So this is crop yield, quality, and timing. So I've explained briefly before. So crop yield is being able to meet a certain deadline. So if you're doing Valentine's Day on the 14th of February, then you need to have 1,000 bunches of red roses for that day. No one wants roses on the 15th of February. So if you don't make that market, you have lost your production. Okay. Quality is looking at whatever those quality requirements are of those markets. So if it's roses, go red. We don't want purple. White's not so exciting. Maybe pink will be all right, but you predominantly want red. Okay. And they will have, your plants will require some attributes such as taste, flavour that you will need to meet for your market if you're in fruit or production. And then once again, that timing, you need to be at the time or being able to manipulate to grow them out of season. So I think I've covered most of this already. So if you have to be able to plan to meet that crop yield, you will lose or be having to pay penalty fines if you don't meet, if you've said you're producing something on this day or at this time frame, then you need to be able to do it. So you will use the techniques that we look at in a moment to ensure that that happens. Then in looking in quality, you need to make sure that you meet those markets. Now, if they export, they will be of a specific, very specific criteria. So we'll have a BRICS level, for example, for kiwi fruit, and you'll have that for apples, etc., and you need to meet the market. If you don't, you may be going into processing, but that's usually second grade and of a much lower quality. So just like I talked about with the hail in Motueka, they did not meet the export requirements. In fact, some of them didn't even meet the local requirements and therefore could not be sold. So timing, so here's, we talked a little bit before, so you aim to meet that market, and I've talked about Valentine's Day, and if we talk about poinsettias, these are usually sold at Christmas. These are short day plants, so they need to be grown in the dark. So they have to be manipulated in a glass house to produce them for that market. We cannot grow them otherwise. Okay, so then another is looking at reliant on the seasons. So some crops can only be grown in the summer because they need the long days for crop maturity. So these are things such as maize, sweet corn, watermelons, and pumpkins, and strawberries. So production of those at the start of the season is very high, and then it will tailor off. It's harder to get strawberries in October to get them ripened than it is in December or January. We've talked about growing degree days, so this is going to be emphasis on your harvesting dates. And then lastly, number 4 is being able to time your production so that you get that high quality volume of high volume of high quality crops. So these are usually done indoors, such as capsicums, to meet those markets. And then if you're looking at outdoors, such as fruiting, you need to thin to ensure that you get those apples that are going to be large, well-coloured and ripened. Okay, so for this production to occur, we need to be looking at those plant processes. And so the big ones are photosynthesis, respiration, transpiration, osmosis, nutrient uptake, and germination. Okay, so you're probably very familiar with those. And I've just put very brief details there on that process. So if you don't get enough water, don't get enough light, if you have a nutrient deficiency and it's too cold, photosynthesis is reduced. Okay, so you want them to be in optimum levels. If we're looking at for respiration, or photosynthesis. The reason for using them is for respiration, for making those fruit, converting that glucose into sucrose, which is stored in fruit. That's the point of fruit, and also as a sexual reproduction organ. But also photosynthesis used for transport, for starch, for storing in seeds, producing those cell walls and those making proteins. So this is all your merit answer, why you are wanting to use increase plant growth. Looking at respiration, so once again, this is affected by water, temperature, and carbon dioxide and oxygen amounts. So predominantly via oxygen. So if you don't get enough of that, then it's not going to occur. Respiration will be reduced. Okay, transpiration. So this is affected by water predominantly, but also wind. Wind will continue to make respiration occur. So therefore, it won't be used in won't be used in growth. So respiration. Light intensity can also increase that evapotranspiration, particularly if it's pretty intense. The humidity and the thickness of the leaves. So once again, that can be manipulated. Osmosis. So this is the water uptake from the soil. You need to have water for it to be able to do that. If there's not enough water, it will not occur. And so flowing on from that is nutrient uptake. So nutrients is taken up through those leaves and then transported right through the plant. So this is talking about your xylem and phloem. So if you've not got enough water uptake, so not enough water in the soil, then this is not going to occur as well as it should. And then looking at germination. So germination needs those wow factors that you would have already previously learned. So this is looking at water, oxygen, and warmth. Some plants may require light, some plants require carbon dioxide, and some may have some soil things that they like. But predominantly it's those three: oxygen, water, and warmth, so temperature. So if it doesn't get those, then your germination is not going to occur. Okay, so that's just talking a little bit more about that growth. So looking at the seed, what happens to it, and providing those physical factors to ensure that photosynthesis occurs. If those things don't occur, then you're not going to get that germination process happening. Okay, so depending on where you are in the country and what your teacher has taught you, there is also a whole lot of other information looking at the development of the plant. So this can cover plant bud and flower formation, pollination, crop ripening, fruit set, fruit colour, sugar levels, which is Brix, flowering, and root growth. And I'm just going to very briefly scroll through the next 10 slides, which are looking at that, and then we're moving into the plant management practices, so techniques. Okay, so this will cover those students that have already covered some of this. This is still all part of the merit part of the answer, looking at that growth and development. Okay, so growing of those shoots are pretty important. You need to be able to get the buds to come out of dormancy and then to start sprouting. So this is predominantly used in fruit trees such as apples, plums, peaches, apricots. And we're wanting to have a growth flush when this occurs in the spring, predominantly when they're warm, humid climate with plenty full of water and nutrients. Then if we look at the root functions, we're wanting it to grow roots the best as possible. So photosynthesis and respiration is required. With the warmer the soils, the faster this is going to happen, and you'll have your better growth for those roots getting down and therefore being able to carry out its growth. Flowers, so we need to have a flower initiation. So depending on what crop you looked at will depend here on whether you cover this or not. But a flower initiation for some crops can occur between 6 and 12 months earlier. So orchids are an example of this, same with apples, predominantly stone fruit as well. So you need to have good nutrition, good light, good temperatures, and good water for that flower initiation to be occurring and then for them to grow. We talked about pollination before. If you have too much wind, pollination usually will not occur. So you need that to happen. Some are bird pollinated like feijoas, so you need to be able to entice those into your orchard. Then fertilization. So once again, that is a process that will need to occur. So pollination occurs and then fertilization. So if there's a disruption in that this stage will not happen. So, for example, if your hail hits, then that will not happen. Fruit set, so this is once those flowers have been pollinated and fertilized, we then get fruit set. Very important in crops such as grapes, where you need to be ensuring that you've got those physical factors. And on that picture at the bottom, you can see that some of the fruit set was not good in that picture, but you need to be looking at mineral nutrition here. You need to be looking at those physical factors. So this will depend on the plant. And then looking at growth of that fruit. So once again, once it's been pollinated and fertilized, then the fruit set has occurred, then the plant needs to get bigger. So obviously you need all the physical factors for the plants to continue to grow, and predominantly water for photosynthesis, your nutrients to be put into the plant. Okay, and this is where your quality and quantity is starting to come in. So you need to be of a certain size, and they need to be a certain flavour, and they need to be looking good. So otherwise you will not be able to sell them. Then fruit ripening, we need to be able to get them to that maturation and ripening stage. So we need to be able to get enough light, enough ripening hours, enough heat hours in order for that to occur. And this increases the sugar content in the fruit. So therefore it's going to mark it being a good Brix level. Okay, so summarising all that, I've just put on the 5 main physical factors. So those are the crosses are showing you the influence that it has. So this is showing you the strongly is the 3 and weakly is a 1. If it's not on there, it's usually not a factor affecting that plant process. Okay, so if you're looking at photosynthesis, you'll see that light is and carbon dioxide is pretty important, with some temperature and humidity thrown in as some minor influences. Okay, so overall showing you that big impact using those main plant processes. Okay, and lastly, looking at growth. So growth is making the plant get bigger, and also the rates of that it grows at. So these can increase or they decrease depending on those physical factors. So if you have a limiting factor, let's say water, then your plant is not growing at its optimum. And this growth rate will affect that quality, quantity, and timing. So if your plant is growing really, really slow, you're not going to meet the timing requirements that you may like. Or it might not meet the quality because it's not sweet enough. Okay, so that is the last part of the sort of the merit. And now we're going to move into the techniques now to modify each of these physical factors. So you absolutely need to know how to carry out each of these a range of techniques for each of the physical factors. There's hundreds, so you're not going to need to know them all, but you have to know how to carry it out. So you need to tell the examiner what the technique is and how you carry out. And then for merit, you are linking it to all that stuff we've just talked about. So plant processes, plant production, and plant growth. Is it increasing plant growth or is it decreasing it? Is it linked to photosynthesis or is it linked to ripening? Okay, pretend the marker is an idiot. You need to make those links clear. Right, so first one we'll look at is light. So here are a huge amount of techniques here for light, and I'm not going to go over them all, otherwise we'll be here forever. So I'm just going to cover a couple. So looking at weeds. So we remove weeds because they are directly in competition with your physical factors. So they're using your plants' light, nutrients, water to grow. So you need to remove them. So some examples are sprays such as herbicides, a push hoe, which is shown in that picture. You can pull them by hand. You can prevent weeds by weed match, mulching, dense planting, or pre-emergent spraying. Okay, so you're trying to remove them so that your plants will grow to the best of their ability. Next one is looking at pruning, and this is done in a variety of ways, but basically you're encouraging the plant to grow, flower, and fruit in the way that the grower wants it to. So you usually this is done for quality and quantity requirements. So you're trying to obtain the best crop possible. So this is to increase the light, so it allows light through the plant. It might be increasing the shape or the size of the fruit or the plant. It might be reducing the spacing or, so that there's more or less competition for those physical factors. And it's basically trying to maintain that balance and allowing to get the quality, quantity, and timing right. Okay, so a couple of examples at the bottom there. Grapes you prune to 2 main stems, usually depends on the system you're using, but that is so that the fruit doesn't all grow in one spot, but it allows for that higher quality. Pine trees you're wanting to grow straight and tall, as it's shown in the picture. So you remove the bottom branches. This improves quality, quantity, and therefore you get a better price because your timber is straighter, longer, and has less knots. Okay, next one is training. So here is just looking at the methods. So once again, you're trying to train. This is usually done in conjunction with pruning and or thinning and or staking. So there's a couple of things there. Basically, you're improving that light penetration into the plant, so better ripening, increased photosynthesis. You're trying to increase the ventilation, so it's getting carbon dioxide around the plant and reducing that humidity. It means your pollination will occur because the bees or insects can get into them, and it means less wind breakage through the plant. And you're supporting it by providing those staking as well. So often these are all done in conjunction with each other. Okay, the next one is temperature. So we have obviously increased temperature and decreased temperature. So there's a range there on increasing temperature techniques, and then there's techniques there just to reduce. Once again, not going to cover them all. We'll just jump straight into protected environments. And this is, I've shown you here, shade house, plastic house, and row coverage. So all of these are to increase that temperature or to decrease, depending on what, where they are. But mostly you are trying to encourage growth from these protected environments. Heating media, so this is increasing the soil temperature. So we have a range of things there, such as mulching, but heat pads. You can cover it with hay. So this is both indoor and outdoor. So there's showing you a range of things there. We also want to be able to heat the air. So here we can do solar heating. We can do gas, hot air ducting, putting a fan in if we want to cool it down. But once again, you're trying to increase or give an optimum air temperature so that you increase that rate of respiration, transpiration, photosynthesis, and evaporation to improve both your growth and your yield. Okay, modifying frost. So here you try to minimize firstly. So this is to where you plant your crops. So if you want to have a frost-free place, plant in Northland because they don't get very many frosts, if any at all. So where you grow them will play a big part. So that's north-facing slopes. Often plant them later so they're not going to get frost. That's why maize is usually planted at the end of October, depending on where you are in the country, because it's too earlier and it'll be hit by frost and they're frost sensitive in the young. However, once your crop is in, then there is some things you can do using windmills, wind machines, helicopters, diesel burners, and overhead sprinklers and frost crops. So I'm showing you now just examples of those. Once again, these are going to increase that air temperature, improve photosynthesis, ensure that growth. But main reason is to stop frost burn and frost killing your plant. So you're trying to reduce that likelihood because you'll have no crop if they are frosted. Okay, moving on to water. Predominantly, we want to get this out of the free from the air, so out of rainfall, but we need to be looking at ways we can manipulate this. So to increase, we're looking at irrigation predominantly, irrigation application and scheduling and control. If we want to maintain, we're looking at tensonometers, mulches, cultivation tillage, contouring or terracing. And if we're wanting to reduce the water content, because depending on our soil type, then you'll be going to be looking at drainage, different types of drainage and drainage management. Okay, so I'm here just putting in some agricultural water measuring techniques. So these are looking at neutron probes, gravimetric soil sampling, tensonometers, water scheduling, budgeting, aquifix. So these are predominantly done in crops that are large scale. So looking at carrot seed production, looking at pea crops. So those types of things, we have to actively measure the soil water to know how much water we should be putting on. Too much, once again, is going to prevent root respiration, and too little, your photosynthesis is reduced. So we want to maintain that at its field capacity. Okay, and there's heaps of ways to increase irrigation in some ways. So I've listed a whole lot there. They are dependent on whether you are inside, outside, large scale, small scale. So all of they are doing is increasing water. And then looking at decreasing, this is your drainage methods. So tile drains, mold drains, humping and hollowing, subsoiling, etc. So a range there. And once again, trying to reduce that water so that respiration can occur. And here, just showing you some other techniques to maintain. So looking at that mulching, cultivation tillage or no tillage. Some places in the world do contouring and terracing, and then looking at your 10 centimetres. Right, moving to humidity. So here we've got a number of techniques that we use. All of them are to try and reduce the amount of water loss from the leaves, so it reduces that transpiration. So you're trying to increase high humidity and keep that warmth, and then you have rapid growth and higher yields, and hopefully they will ripen earlier. So just showing you a couple of techniques. So there of misting, of opening vents, so ventilation, and looking at propagation tents there. And then to hail, so this is looking at the three big ones, which is hail netting, hail insurance, hail rockets, and hail cannons. Sometimes these are effective. You have to be onto it. Hail netting is what most people use, and you can see that in that picture on the left-hand side. So this stops the hail from hitting your crop. Rockets and cannons are used with differing efficiency. And then if we're moving into carbon dioxide, oxygen, and nitrogen manipulation, we usually in glass houses add carbon dioxide, and it's called carbon dioxide enrichment. And way we do that is usually by burning propane gas or releasing carbon dioxide into the air. A really cheap way is just opening windows and allowing an exchange of air, but you can add those to it. Other ways to increase is to add fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizer to your soils, and that will increase your nitrogen capacity there. But lots of, usually not used in manipulation of nitrogen gas. Wind, so here we're looking at shelter belts, providing shelters, staking and tying to try and reduce that impacts of wind. So here's showing you some shelter belts, artificial and natural. And then also moving into shelter, so providing your plants shelter from that wind to make sure that it is reducing those extremes. So it can reduce the wind and the damage, which is obviously what you're wanting. That improves your growth and your quality, but also it can increase the temperature, so it speeds up that growth. It increases humidity. It can reduce rainfall and humidity, hail damage, and it can be automated. So in glass houses, etc., you can open and shut depending on the wind levels. So providing shelter of some description. And then techniques for topography. So this is site selection, where you actually choose your site. And so we'll just move straight into those because those are some examples. But site selection, you need to choose that wisely. So right from the start. For example, citrus, they don't like cold, wet soils. So they need to be grown where there's warm, non-wet soils. Sweet corn, for example, requires 2,200 growing degree days. So you need to be growing in areas where that occurs, otherwise it won't get full maturity. And then just even moving on to site establishment, so how you set up your site, so orientation of your crops north to south for maximising that soil exposure, how you prepare your soil, so mounding for carrots, onions, tomatoes, citrus, they all require mounding, how you set that soil up for pH, liming and fertiliser, nutrition, and then also looking at its irrigation. Moving into soils, so we're just about done. So different types of things we can do here for soils, and I'm not going to go into these a huge amount because we could be here all day, but those are your predominant ones, looking at fertilizers, liming, mulching, composting, and fertigation. Okay, so you can apply all those to modify your soil. Okay, just about 2 more minutes, just looking at excellence and how we can obtain those. So here for excellence, you need to evaluate those, as we said at the start of the hour, on those three things. So we're going to start with economic first. So you need to basically be comparing this and stating why it's done. So why are you doing that technique? What cost does that technique cost you? And what is it getting in return? How does it gain in yield, quality, or timing? So it might mean if you implement a particular technique that it's going to be a reduction in labour or a reduction in machinery or fuel costs. It might mean that you're reducing your irrigation requirements, so you're going to have a bigger organic matter in the soil, so it's going to increase your plant growth. It might be a huge outlay of investment right at the start, so $30,000 for hail netting per hectare. But what is the benefit of that? That is, you won't get hail impacting your crop, so you will have a crop to sell. It might be lowering of that running costs. Might mean you have a consistent harvest, which is good for your export market. It might mean you're ripening your fruit earlier, so therefore you're going to be on those shoulder seasons better, etc. Okay, so you need to be relating that back to that technique. So it could be either a justify or a compare and contrast. Okay, once again, environmental, it's going to depend on your technique, but usually we can break these into positive and negatives. So positively, we will carry out a technique because it does something good for the environment. So it might improve biodiversity, it might improve soil fertility, it could be reducing erosion, it could be it's a better habitat for other species. Or it could be a negative. It could be that it reduces the water temperature, or it takes water out of a stream, so therefore that's not so good for the stream life. It could be that it's providing runoff from your fertilization. It could be that whitewash is needed and that you somehow need to remove that, and a chopper is going to come in and it's going to be noisy, so that will have exhaust pollution, etc. So whatever it is, that you need to relate it back. So if you do this, what impact does it have on the environment? And then lastly, looking at social. So what impact does these techniques socially have? So all of them will be providing employment, so jobs in your community. So they're all positive things. So it means you can have money going back into your community. So they're going to have increased employment, you'll have increased spending, therefore your rural communities will continue to survive. So this increases land values. Negative things can be looking at putting up big shade cloths in white and but ugly, or bringing in a chopper which is really noisy and wakes up the neighbours at 4 a.m. in the morning because you're wanting to reduce frosts. Could be that you use too much water, or the technique uses too much water for irrigation, and therefore you lose that recreational use. It could be that if you don't use frost protection or hail protection, then you can't employ people because you haven't got a crop to harvest. So all these things are dependent on your technique that you chose, but you have to then justify or compare and contrast what impact that technique is having on your crop. Okay, so that's it. That's the nutshell. It's a huge standard, and you're not going to need all those techniques, and you're not going to need all those plant production processes, but it will be dependent on the questions that are given to you. So hopefully that's been helpful, and that you've got something out of it. Good luck for your exam on Monday.
Thank you very much, Kerry. You weren't wrong. It's absolutely huge. Great work on those slides. I think I might have to up my game to match your standards. Could you, just out of personal curiosity, could you expand on how a hail rocket or cannon works?
Yes, so hail, so two different types. One's a sonic boom, and it gives out a big bang, and those vibrations that are given off from that sound theoretically breaks up the hail molecules so that they therefore fall into smaller droplets. So rather than being big one solid mass, they drop. One of the other ones, the rockets, it puts in a compound into the air, a nitrogen compound into the air, and theoretically that impacts on the hail molecules once again and breaks them up. They are both quite controversial. Some people really rate them. They're used a lot overseas, and some people say they're not very effective at all. But the biggest thing is that socially they have a big social implication because they're really noisy, and some of the rock or the cannons go off every 30 seconds for as long as the thunderstorm is there. So if the thunderstorm's sitting over for half an hour, it's going every 30 seconds for half an hour. So the community hates it. But very effective if you can stop that hail. But most people have moved to hail netting and insurance, but insurance is getting harder to obtain. So, and it's quite expensive. So most people are moving to the hail netting. So,
wow, yeah, it's fascinating. I'd never realised there was quite so much to it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and for producing this beautiful resource. And we'll look forward to hearing from you tomorrow. Is the next one?
Yes, that's right. So on livestock growth and development. Yeah.
Awesome. Livestock growth and development.
Won't be quite so much in it. That's not quite as got as much content. So yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Kerry. And yep, if you've got your level 2 AgHort exam coming up next week, then you might want to jump on to tomorrow's webinar as well. And then is it one the following day?
Yes. Yep. So land use on Friday. Yeah.
Land use on Friday. Lovely. Thanks again, Kerry. Have
No
a great
problem.
day. And we'll see you tomorrow.
Day.